Arthur Schopenhauer hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 days. It was 1840, and the 52-year-old philosopher sat alone in his Frankfurt apartment, surrounded by books he'd written that almost no one had read, developing a theory that would eventually influence everyone from Nietzsche to Freud to Einstein. But at that moment, he was conducting what might be the most radical experiment in human history, the systematic study of what happens when you stop participating in the world's endless demand for noise. He wasn't depressed. He wasn't hiding. He was listening. And what he heard in that silence would shatter everything people thought they knew about consciousness, suffering, and what it actually means to be alive. Because Schopenhauer had discovered something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, that beneath all our talking, all our thinking, all our desperate attempts to fill every moment with sound and activity, there exists a force so powerful and so terrifying that we've built our entire civilization around not having to face it. But here's the twist that no one saw coming, including Schopenhauer himself. The very thing we're most afraid to encounter in silence isn't our enemy. It's the key to everything we've been searching for through all our noise. But Schopenhauer's relationship with silence wasn't born from wisdom. It was born from pain, isolation, and a growing realization that the world he inhabited was nothing like the world he had been promised. Arthur Schopenhauer entered the world in 1788 in what is now Gdansk, Poland, but his family's wealth would soon relocate them to Hamburg, Germany, where young Arthur would spend his formative years surrounded by the constant chatter of international commerce. His father, Heinrich, was a successful merchant whose life revolved around negotiation, persuasion, and the endless exchange of words for profit. The Schopenhauer household was rarely quiet, filled with business discussions, social gatherings, and the perpetual hum of a family embedded in the commercial world. From an early age, Arthur was expected to follow this path of constant communication, to master the art of commercial conversation, to learn how to use words as tools for acquisition and success. But something in the young boy recoiled from this expectation. While his father spoke of markets and profits, Arthur found himself drawn to books, to solitary contemplation, to the spaces between words where something else seemed to live. The first crack in Arthur's prescribed future came during a European tour his parents arranged to prepare him for his merchant career. As they traveled through England, France, and other parts of Europe, Arthur was supposed to be observing business practices, learning the art of international trade, absorbing the lessons of commercial success. Instead, he found himself witnessing something entirely different, the pervasive suffering that seemed to underlie all human activity, regardless of social class or economic status. In the bustling markets, he saw not opportunity, but desperation. In the grand salons, he observed not joy, but performance. In the constant chatter of commerce and society, he began to hear not communication, but noise, an endless stream of words that seemed designed not to convey truth, but to obscure it, not to connect people, but to manipulate them. It was during this trip that Arthur first began to understand the power of silence, not as emptiness, but as clarity. In the quiet moments between the programmed activities, in the spaces where he was left alone with his thoughts, he began to perceive patterns that the noise of daily life made invisible. When Arthur finally chose academics over commerce, his father was devastated. But for Arthur, this wasn't rebellion. It was necessity. He had discovered that the world of constant talk, of endless persuasion and negotiation, wasn't just unsuited to his temperament. It was actively harmful to what he was beginning to recognize as his true purpose. At the University of Göttingen and later at Berlin, Arthur encountered academic philosophy, expecting to find kindred spirits who valued contemplation and genuine inquiry. Instead, he found something that disappointed him even more than his father's commercial world. Professors who used complex language to obscure simple truths, who engaged in verbal gymnastics to avoid confronting the fundamental questions of existence, who treated philosophy not as a search for wisdom, but as an opportunity for intellectual performance. The academic philosophers talked endlessly, but they said nothing. They filled lecture halls with words, but those words seemed designed to impress rather than illuminate, to demonstrate cleverness rather than pursue truth. Schopenhauer began to see that silence wasn't just preferable to meaningless chatter, it was morally superior to it. This realization would drive him away from academic life and into a decade of solitary work that would produce his revolutionary philosophical system. But it was during these years of relative isolation that Schopenhauer would discover the true dimensions of silence's power. Working alone, often for hours without speaking to another human being, Schopenhauer began to perceive what he would later call the will, the blind, unconscious force that drives all existence. But this perception didn't come through reasoning or analysis in the traditional sense. It came through a kind of silent observation, a patient watching of his own mind and the world around him, without the interference of constant internal or external chatter. In silence, Schopenhauer discovered the usual barriers between observer and observed began to dissolve. The endless stream of thoughts, judgments, and verbal processing that normally mediated his experience of reality would quiet, and in that quietude, something more fundamental would reveal itself. This wasn't meditation in the Eastern sense, though Schopenhauer would later recognize the similarities to Buddhist practice. This was simply the natural result of spending extended periods in genuine silence, not just the absence of external noise, but the quieting of the internal monologue that most people mistake for consciousness itself. What Schopenhauer found in this silence was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it revealed that most of what he had taken to be his self was actually just noise, an endless stream of desires, fears, judgments, and reactions that obscured rather than revealed his true nature. Terrifying because what lay beneath this noise was something vast, impersonal, and indifferent to human happiness. The will that Schopenhauer perceived in silence wasn't malevolent, but it wasn't benevolent either. It was simply there, a fundamental force that expressed itself through all living things, driving them to survive, reproduce, and perpetuate themselves without any ultimate purpose or meaning. In silence, stripped of the comforting stories and explanations that language provides, this reality became undeniable. But here's where Schopenhauer's insight became revolutionary. If the will could be perceived in silence, perhaps it could also be transcended in silence. If the endless cycle of desire and suffering that characterized human existence was driven by this blind force, perhaps stepping outside the cycle into genuine silence offered a kind of escape. This wasn't the escapism of distraction or entertainment. Those were just different forms of noise, ways of avoiding rather than confronting the fundamental nature of existence. The silence Schopenhauer advocated was more like a kind of conscious resistance, a refusal to participate in the will's endless demands for more activity, more stimulation, more engagement. In his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer would argue that most human suffering comes from the will's insatiable nature. We want things, we get them. We immediately want other things. We achieve goals, only to discover that achievement brings not satisfaction, but new desires. We engage in relationships, careers, and pursuits that promise fulfillment, but deliver only temporary relief from the underlying restlessness that drives all human activity. But in silence, genuine silence that encompasses both external quiet and an internal stillness, this cycle could be interrupted. Not permanently, perhaps, but long enough to gain perspective on it, to see it clearly rather than being blindly driven by it. Schopenhauer's personal life became a kind of experiment in applied silence. He lived alone for most of his adult life, not out of misanthropy, but out of recognition that most social interaction was simply noise. People talking at each other rather than with each other, performing their personalities rather than communicating their authentic thoughts and feelings. He established routines that maximized periods of silence and minimized unnecessary social engagement. He would rise early, when the world was quiet, and spend his most productive hours in solitary work. He would take long, silent walks, observing the world without the constant commentary that most people provide for themselves. He would sit in cafes and public spaces, not to socialize but to observe human behavior with the clarity that silence provides. This wasn't hermetism or social withdrawal in the conventional sense. Schopenhauer maintained relationships and engaged with the world when necessary, but he did so from a position of silence. bringing to these interactions the clarity and perspective that solitude had provided, rather than the noise and reactivity that characterize most human communication. The results were remarkable. During his decades of practicing this kind of conscious silence, Schopenhauer produced philosophical works of extraordinary depth and clarity. His insights into human nature, the role of art and beauty, and the possibilities for transcending suffering would influence virtually every major thinker who came after him. But perhaps more importantly, he discovered that silence wasn't just a tool for philosophical inquiry. It was a way of life that offered genuine relief from the restlessness and dissatisfaction that plague most human existence. In silence, Schopenhauer found the usual urgency of desire would fade. The constant need to achieve, acquire, or become something other than what he was would quiet. And in that quietude, something else would emerge. Not happiness in the conventional sense, but something more like peace, a kind of contentment that didn't depend on circumstances or achievements, but simply on being present to what is, without the constant commentary and judgment that language provides. This discovery led Schopenhauer to one of his most radical insights, that most of what we call living is actually a form of unconsciousness. We move through our days driven by impulses we don't understand, pursuing goals we haven't consciously chosen, reacting to circumstances with patterns of thought and behavior that we've never examined. The constant noise of modern life, both external and internal, keeps us in this unconscious state. We're always responding, always reacting, always engaged in the next task or conversation or distraction. We rarely, if ever, simply stop and listen to what's actually happening in our own minds and bodies, in the present moment, in the world around us. Silence, for Schopenhauer, was a return to consciousness. It was a way of stepping out of the endless cycle of stimulus and response that characterizes most human existence and into a space of genuine awareness. And in that awareness, he discovered, lay possibilities for freedom that most people never even imagine. This wasn't freedom in the political or social sense, though Schopenhauer was certainly concerned with those issues. This was freedom at a more fundamental level, freedom from the compulsive patterns of thought and behavior that keep most people trapped in cycles of desire and dissatisfaction. In silence, it became possible to observe these patterns without being caught up in them, to see desires arise without immediately acting on them, to watch thoughts and emotions come and go without identifying completely with them, to experience the present moment without the constant overlay of judgment, comparison, and mental commentary that usually mediates our relationship to reality. But Schopenhauer also recognized that this kind of silence couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The demands of practical life, the needs of the body, the requirements of survival all eventually require engagement with the world of noise and activity. The key, he discovered, was to return to silence regularly enough to maintain perspective, to remember what lies beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. This practice of conscious silence would become central to Schopenhauer's approach to art and beauty as well. He argued that great art works by temporarily silencing the will's constant demands, creating spaces of pure perception where we can see reality clearly without the distortion of personal desire or fear. When we stand before a beautiful painting, listen to moving music, or read profound poetry, something in us becomes quiet. The usual mental chatter fades, and we enter a state of absorption that resembles the silence Schopenhauer cultivated in his daily life. In these moments, he argued, we get a glimpse of what consciousness might be like if it weren't constantly driven by the will's demands. This insight would make Schopenhauer one of the first philosophers to take art seriously as a form of knowledge, as a way of understanding reality that complements but doesn't depend on rational analysis. Art, like silence, could provide access to truths that remained hidden in the noise of ordinary consciousness. But perhaps Schopenhauer's most profound insight was that silence isn't something we have to create. It's something we have to uncover. Beneath all the noise of thoughts, emotions, desires, and reactions, silence is always already there. It's the background against which all experience takes place, the space in which all activity occurs. Most people, Schopenhauer observed, are afraid of this silence. They fill their lives with constant activity, entertainment, and stimulation because silence forces them to confront questions they'd rather avoid. Who am I really? beneath all my roles and identities? What do I actually want, as opposed to what I think I should want? What is the meaning of this existence, if any? These questions can be uncomfortable, even frightening, but Schopenhauer discovered that avoiding them is far more painful than confronting them. The endless cycle of desire and dissatisfaction that characterizes most human life is, in large part, a result of never stopping long enough to examine what we're actually doing and why. Silence provides the space for this examination, not the aggressive self-analysis that often passes for introspection, but a gentle, patient observation of what's actually happening in consciousness from moment to moment. And in that observation, Schopenhauer found, lay the possibility of genuine wisdom. In his later years, as recognition finally came, and his works began to influence a new generation of thinkers, Schopenhauer would often reflect on the paradox of his situation. He had become famous for ideas that emerged from decades of relative obscurity and silence. The very insights that the world now celebrated had come not from engagement with the world, but from stepping back from it. This paradox, he realized, perfectly illustrated his central point about silence. Its power doesn't come from withdrawal or escape, but from the clarity and perspective it provides. When we learn to access silence regularly, we bring that clarity into our engagement with the world. We speak when we have something to say rather than simply to fill space. We act from understanding rather than compulsion. We relate to others from a place of genuine presence rather than performing our personalities. As Schopenhauer aged, he continued to refine his understanding of silence's role in human life. He came to see it not as a technique or practice, but as a way of being, a fundamental orientation toward existence that values understanding over activity, presence over performance, truth over comfort. This orientation, he discovered, was naturally attractive to others. People who cultivate genuine silence develop a kind of magnetic quality, not because they're trying to be impressive, but because they're actually present. In a world of constant noise and distraction, presence itself becomes rare and precious. When Arthur Schopenhauer died in 1860, he left behind not just a philosophical system, but a lived example of silence's transformative power. He had demonstrated that it was possible to live differently, to step out of the endless cycle of noise and reactivity that characterizes most human existence, and to find in that stepping out not emptiness, but fullness, not withdrawal, but deeper engagement. His influence on subsequent thinkers, artists, and writers would be immense, but perhaps his greatest contribution was simply showing that silence is possible in a noisy world, and that this possibility isn't just a luxury for philosophers, but a necessity for anyone seeking genuine understanding of themselves and their place in existence. Today, in an era of unprecedented noise and distraction, Schopenhauer's insights about silence feel more relevant than ever. We live in a world that seems designed to prevent the kind of quiet contemplation he advocated, a world of constant connectivity, endless entertainment options, and social pressures to be always engaged, always productive, always available. But perhaps this makes his example more valuable, not less. Schopenhauer showed that silence isn't something the world gives us. It's something we must claim for ourselves. It's not a luxury we can afford only when circumstances permit, but a necessity we must prioritize if we want to live consciously, rather than simply reacting to whatever demands the world places on us. The power of silence, as Schopenhauer understood it, isn't the power to escape the world, but the power to see it clearly. It's the power to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be driven, to be present rather than perpetually distracted by what was or what might be. In the end, Schopenhauer's greatest teaching might be this, that in a world full of noise, the most radical act is simply to be quiet long enough to hear what's actually happening, and in that hearing, to discover not just what the world is, but who we are beneath all the noise we usually mistake for ourselves. The silence he discovered wasn't empty. It was full of everything we usually miss in our rush to speak, to act, to become something other than what we already are. Perhaps that's the most profound insight of all, that what we're seeking through all our noise and activity is already present in the silence we're so afraid to encounter. The peace we pursue through endless engagement is waiting in the stillness we're constantly fleeing. And the understanding we hope to gain through accumulating experiences and achievements is available right now, in the space between thoughts, in the pause between breaths, in the silence that surrounds and supports every word we speak. Schopenhauer spent his life learning to listen to that silence. And in learning to listen, he discovered not just a philosophy, but a way of being that transformed suffering into wisdom, isolation into independence, and the darkness of existence into a light that still illuminates our path today.